Hello everyone, Stuckery here, and you and I both know just how much we love video games. Hey, guess what, guys? This video is actually brought to you by my friends at Nvidia GeForce Now. That's right, my friends, we've hit it big in gaming. So big that my friends over at Nvidia actually asked me to talk about the history of video games, which I mean, considering that I'm me, and you all know me from my shorts and everything else, of course I'm gonna go and talk about the history of gaming. Are you kidding me? Looking back, the story of video games itself is an absolutely fascinating story, something with many different sub-stories that is spread throughout it. Whether this be by title, by company, by genre, or even platform, there are literally a million different possible stories that I could tell in an ever-expanding saga of something that, as I said, is just going and going and going and going. And perhaps none of these different areas are more recent in development or could be possibly more massive than cloud gaming, which for many users could very well be the future. The story of cloud gaming is something that is filled with hope, it is filled with ambition, but it is also something that is filled with struggle and failure for anyone who's familiar with the subject. I mean, I want you to just imagine something for a second. I want you to imagine the possibility of being able to play a ridiculously high-end and demanding game on a janky laptop from a decade ago with very few quality differences than if you just had your own $3,000 high-end desktop. But to explain that and then the insane future that we are coming into now, we're going to need to go and look back at the history a bit. Since the early days of computers, people have found ways to play games on them, which is something that is going to sound obvious to us now, but things were very different back in the day, and it didn't quite look like this. Back in the 1940s and 1950s, computers would take up entire rooms, and these things were so expensive that only universities, governments, and large corporations could even afford them in the first place. Most people had very limited understandings of what these electronic behemoths could even do, and the kinds of mathematical equations that these machines were regularly programmed to calculate. Back in the day, people weren't necessarily thinking of how to game on one of these, especially when you'd have to walk halfway across the room just to plug something else in. That is some serious lag in input time. But fast forward in time to the 1960s, and there's a group of MIT students who begin to create one of the world's first computer games. You have student Steve Russell and his friends who were given access to the school's new PDP-1 computer on the condition that they use it to create a demo program that was going to change everything. Inspired by the science fiction novels that Russell and his friends enjoyed, these computer hackers decided to create two spaceships for a dueling game. The result, called Space War, would become a sensation on campus, and variations of the game would soon spread to other universities with computer engineering programs. Which is awesome, we have the first viral video game, so to speak, but the issue is that while Space War was fun to play, it was never really intended to be released to the general public because computers were simply way too expensive to use for personal use. Playing Space War required access to a computer that was going to be at a research facility, at a university, at a corporation, something which was going to severely limit the game's impact. Not to mention that the concept of even installing a game in the first place, that is not something that even existed yet. These were things that were pre-built into the system, but that would change with Star Trek. And yes, when I talk about that, I do mean the show, of course, but in this case, I also mean the game. And what do I mean by that? So here's how it is then. In the year 1971, Star Trek the original series had been canceled for 2 years by this point. This is a show that for the years that it ran resonated with a large swath of the American public, and from that, with a particular type of person, computer nerds. As we already said, anyone who was working with computers was doing so in a university or some other type of program. These were people who were publishing and sharing their custom programs in professional journals and magazines because there was simply no way for them to do anything with computers at home at that point. And also, much like today, many of these computer programmers also happen to be fans of science fiction programs, like in the case of Star Trek. And for the sake of our story, one of these prospective programmers was a guy by the name of Mike Mayfield, who would write the first version of the Star Trek computer game using the basic programming language, compiling and testing his game on a Sigma 7 mainframe. Inspired by the early Space War game that was present on some early college computers, Mayfield wanted to create a Star Trek video game that was capable of running on any computer system that he could get access to. And so for this reason, he devised a control system that was based around pressing buttons on a keyboard as well as a text-based graphical interface, something that could be displayed on computer screens or just printed out on a piece of paper. Yeah, that's right, normally when we're talking about computer games, we're not typically thinking of playing a game on a printer, but hey, it's the 1970s, you know, so things are very different at that point. Either way, instead of trying to sell it to a company or keep it for himself, Mayfield instead shares his Star Trek game into the public space, into the public domain, as a software that other programmers are capable of tinkering with and then running on their own computers. And variants of this game then become very popular among programmers. Not only that, but now Star Trek fans, lay people, just the average person could start to get access to this. By using ASC2 characters to create visual space maps for players to interpret, Mayfield was able to create a game that could be displayed on nearly any kind of monitor, or if you didn't have a monitor, printed out with teleprinter. Additionally, because Star Trek was simple and text-based, this made it easy for Mayfield and other programmers to create randomly generated star maps for each new game cycle, something that would be an early form of procedural generation. And mind you, this is the 1970s that we're talking about at this point. The really crazy part about all this is that as a text-based video game written in BASIC, Star Trek 1971 could, and still can be to this very day, run on nearly any computer system possible, whether that be through digital installation or being manually typed in line by line. You can put it on any device possible. Now, of course, I'm sure to many of you, the idea of installing a video game onto a computer, that's not something that's very impressive. Like, that is something that to this day is very commonplace, but back in the 1970s, when video games like Space War or Pong or anything like that were hard-coded into their machines, the concept of a game being installed, that is revolutionary. Literally anyone could just take the basic code for this game and install it, and by encouraging other programmers to install, run, and modify his Star Trek game, Mayfield would help to popularize the concept of PC gaming itself, something that literally did not exist, but now you could transfer a game to many different devices, almost like a cloud. Except here, it was first done on a punch tape on a multi-100-pound device that was incapable of being easily transported from one place to the next, but you know, you could always take the tape, so that was nice. Now, at this point, we're going to be moving forward rather rapidly through the next bit of history, as it's way too much to cover in its entirety, but it needs to be stated before we get into the proper history of cloud gaming itself. Starting in rapid order, in 1977, Atari would release the Atari 2600, also known as the Video Computer System, this being a home console that featured joysticks and interchangeable game cartridges that would play multicolored games, effectively kicking off the second generation of video game consoles. After this, Activision was launched, which was the first third-party game developer, which means that developers would make software without actually making the consoles to specifically go with them, like in the case of arcade cabinets or anything like that, in 1979. This was huge, as the console companies before this made exclusively everything in-house. Like, every single game that you made was specifically part of a thing for one console made by the console company itself. Fast forward after that, and in 1983, the North American video game industry would experience a major crash. As for why this happened, there are a number of reasons, including very oversaturated game console markets, competition from varying different computer games, and a surplus of overhyped and low-quality games, such as the infamous E.T. game, which was an Atari game based on the very famous movie, and often considered to be the worst video game ever created. Lasting a couple years, the crash would lead to the bankruptcy of several home computer and video game console companies, which would pretty badly damage the industry for several years. That being until the video game industry would begin to recover in 1985, when the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES system, called Famicom in Japan, would come to the United States. The NES had improved 8-bit graphics, colors, sound, and gameplay over previous consoles, and many of the franchises that were spawned from this are still around today, such as Super Mario Bros., The Legend of Zelda, and Metroid. Then in 1989, Sega would go and release its 16-bit Genesis console in North America as a successor to its 1986 Sega Master System, which had failed to compete against the NES. With its technical superiority over the NES, some wild and clever marketing, and the 1991 release of the Sonic the Hedgehog game, the Genesis made very significant headway against its rival. This was then responded to in 1991 with Nintendo releasing its own 16-bit Super NES console in North America, which would in turn launch the first ever real console war before PlayStation and Xbox ever had that. And for those that remember the console wars of Xbox and PlayStation, like from the OG days when it was Xbox versus the original PlayStation, just like that, you get what it is that I'm talking about here, as these companies and consoles would battle out over exclusives. But that could easily become another story itself, as PlayStation and 3D gaming would follow shortly after in the mid-90s. And all of this, everything that we have talked about, finally finally leads us to cloud gaming as an experimental tech in a market whose members have already been fighting each other for decades, as we previously covered. I'm going to need to explain this concept here for a second, but cloud gaming refers to a way to deliver computer games to users where computationally complex games are executed on powerful cloud servers. The rendered game scenes are then streamed over the internet to gamers on varying different types of devices, and the control events from input devices are then sent back to cloud servers for interaction. And while this is definitely a new and revolutionary tech, what many people don't realize is that the tech itself is actually a little bit older than what we thought. In fact, the first demonstration of cloud gaming technology was by startup G-Cluster, which is short for Game Cluster. This is something which introduced its product back at the 2000 E3 and released around 2003. The quotes that I have here come directly from the company itself at the time that things were in the works in 2001, so take what I'm saying now with a grain of salt because things changed over time as they went. Quote, "We believe wireless gaming should be as good as traditional computer games and console gaming, if not better." This coming from Mika Peltola, the CEO of G-Cluster. Quote, "G-Cluster technology elevates wireless gaming way beyond the typical stick figure or card game. Your favorite titles can now be delivered to the palm of your hand." The games will be available initially in selected areas called hotspots, where local wireless networks can be deployed quickly. Numerous hotels, airport lounges, amusement parks, and coffee shops already have existing infrastructure available to deliver the service. The first G-Cluster spots will appear in Helsinki in August of 2001, with locations in the United States by 2002. Yeah, for those of you who didn't catch, this was a Finnish company. G-Cluster will provide hotspot operators with all necessary hardware and software, including wireless devices that can be rented for gaming. G-Cluster will also provide the operators with complete billing, marketing, management, and support solution. Users at hotspots can either rent a wireless device or use their own laptop to play G-Screen games. Payment is then based on the amount of time played. Because of the network technology, players will be able to engage other players in their area in multiplayer games. Which all that sounds crazy, right? That sounds amazing! But, of course, there's a bit of a problem. Remember the year in which I said that this takes place? This is the 2000s, the very early 2000s. And mind you, I am a guy who was born in the 90s. I absolutely love my childhood from growing up in the 90s going into the early 2000s. I know the tech and I love it, but I also know its limitations. The greatest strength and also simultaneous weakness of cloud gaming is that it relies on the internet to function instead of your actual device. And so due to restricted internet speeds and infrastructure that existed at the time, deploying such a service on a broad scale is something that would face very major hurdles. Sadly, due to latency and bandwidth issues, these experimental services were just too advanced for the internet infrastructure of the day. Connectivity and internet speed would manage to grow by leaps and bounds over the course of the decade, but the world was really not yet ready for cloud gaming in the year 2000. The next event that we're going to be talking about would take place in the year 2003, which I know that the picture behind me here is really blurry, but there's very few options that I was able to actually find for this. In early 2003, there was another attempt that was announced by American company Infinium Labs, which wanted to change everything with their Phantom video game console, a device that was hoped to be capable of providing a on-demand video game delivery service via a monthly online subscription. The Phantom was designed to run PC games, thus making it compatible with hundreds of titles from the start, and it was supposed to be sold at a much lower price than high-end PC gaming rigs. A functioning prototype was first presented for this at E3 2004, running the Unreal Tournament 2004, and then again at QuakeCon, where it was shown to be capable of perfectly operating Quake 3 Arena on a dedicated server. Which is awesome, but then after a couple years of setbacks, the company bankrupted in 2008, with the Phantom console never officially releasing to the market, and becoming just another case of Vaporware. Which, for anyone confused about that terminology, Vaporware is a product or service that is announced to the public, but it never really releases or functions, and so it just dies. If you want to compare this to anything, I want you to think about the sheer amount of games that release into early access, but then never really fully function or do anything, and so they just end up dying. But anyway, moving on, in 2010, with improvements in data, in video compression, and smartphone capabilities, the potential for gaming on the cloud itself rose, and services like OnLive and Gaikai were announced around this time. OnLive had acquired some support from large publishers like Ubisoft, 2K Games, and THQ, but found it difficult to get other publishers on board as they were very wary of the subscription price model. Gaikai, on the other hand, was acquired by Sony Computer Entertainment in July of 2012 for $340 million, which is a massive amount, and by October of 2012 was offering PlayStation games on the cloud. Ultimately, though, the technology behind Gaikai was instead used by Sony as the foundation for their own service that they would make, PlayStation Now, first introduced in 2014. OnLive, on the other hand, well, that ended up never actually making a profit, and was then acquired by a new entity, which I kid you not was called OnLive 2, for a mere $4.8 million, something that was a mere fraction of what it once was. After that failed as well, OnLive and OL2's intellectual property was then acquired by Sony Computer Entertainment in April of 2015, and then shut down a month later. They would then use that technology from these acquisitions for their own PlayStation Now service. And so here it is that we first properly get to meet the sponsor of today's video, as I previously had mentioned, Nvidia. Nvidia's GeForce Now beta launched back in 2015, and it was something that would mark a very significant milestone. This effort aimed to grant customers the ability to access a collection of games that they had purchased on platforms like Steam, thus enabling them to play these games via remote servers. And that was a pretty big game changer, so to speak. Because remember this, back in the year 2014, Sony had also launched PlayStation Now, which enabled players to stream selected PlayStation games to different devices. But the problem is, again, here, that you are limited to select PlayStation titles. That is something that is going to severely limit one's market. Nvidia actually did this as well too first with Nvidia Shield. This would be a subscription service that would provide users with unlimited access to a library of games hosted on Nvidia servers for the life of the subscription, being delivered to subscribers through streaming video. Certain titles were also available via a buy and play model, and this version ultimately ended up being discontinued in 2019 after transitioning to a new version of the service that would enable Shield users to play their own games that they already had in varying game libraries. And here, my friends, is where we enter into the wild west of gaming, uncharted territory, and the story diverges between two competitors, Google and its Stadia, and Nvidia and its GeForce Now. Oh man, do you remember Stadia? Yeah, that was something. Yeah, back when Google Stadia announced itself back in 2019, there was a lot of big promises for what Google, which had been largely an outsider to the business, called the, quote, future of gaming. Stadia was supposed to be a streaming platform that would go across multiple devices, allowing players to access games with devices that they already had without the need to buy different consoles. It would integrate with YouTube. It would allow capture, streaming, and sharing, as well as the ability to jump straight from a YouTube video of a game into an instance of that same game. It promised to be more powerful than the PS4 and Xbox One combined. And these promises, mind you, are massive for a company that had literally not done much with gaming before, and that was going to show. Upon the reveal of the actual business model later in 2019, public perception of the Stadia would take its first negative turn, the first of many. At Stadia's launch in November of 2019, Google Stadia would be only available through a Founders Edition bundle, something that was quite pricey, as well as a Pro subscription. Almost immediately, that ended the possibility of it being highly accessible as they promised. Games, in the meanwhile, would largely sell for the full price alongside the subscription fee, which then largely turned the public against them. Full price for essentially what are rentals? F that noise. Full price for games that you won't actually own? Lol. Too expensive, $60 a game plus $15 a month? No way. I'll pay $500 for a PS5 instead of $129 upfront and get gauged in the end. These fears would remain through Stadia's launch, where the general consensus was more or less that the technology was revolutionary, it was good, but the business model was an absolute disaster. Now, truthfully, I could do an entire video on the rise and fall of Google Stadia itself, but that would be an entire other operation in and of itself. So, rather than talk about failure, we will talk about success. Since GeForce Now would exit beta in February of 2020, the service would sign up millions of users who would stream millions of hours every month, according to Nvidia. But GeForce Now's new groundbreaking model would also raise some question, because think on it like this. When a user purchases a digital key to a game, it's usually with the thought that the game will be played in a specific platform like Steam. But GeForce Now would change that question entirely. Like, yes, the purchased digital game was technically the player's to use, but was it okay to play on something that the publisher never put it on in the first place? It was because of this type of question that Nvidia would go and shift to a opt-in program, something that would let developers fully control whether or not their games would appear on the platform. And here, things just kind of then exploded in size to the point that I can only imagine what the future is going to actually bring. First, Valve would announce that it was launching a beta of its Steam Cloud Play services for its storefront that would integrate with other cloud gaming services, including GeForce Now, giving full access to Steam games. Next, on September 30th, 2021, GeForce GeForce Now had announced that Electronic Arts games, including Battlefield, Mirror Edge Catalyst, Unravel, and the Dragon Age franchises, would all be available to play on the cloud. And then in February 2023, Microsoft would announce that it was going to bring its Xbox PC Games Pass to Nvidia's GeForce Now cloud streaming service. And on top of that, with Microsoft buying out Blizzard, the company behind the World of Warcraft game series, and Overwatch, which happened this past year in late 2023, that means that they would get those games as well. These absolutely massive acquisitions would mean that Nvidia would sit on top of a veritable cloud gaming throne in 2024, with over 1,800 games in its library, far outstripping most competitors in the field. With Nvidia GeForce Now, you would get tons of supported digital stores, whether Steam, Battle.net, Xbox PC Game Pass titles, and the Microsoft Store, Epic Games Store, Ubisoft, Connect, GOG.com, and EA. All of this is massive. And it's even better from that because there would be no need to repurchase the games that you already own. In regards to the actual download of those games, as we all know today, games are massive, and these large game downloads take a long time. Whether downloading the game in the first place, updating, the patches for it, it takes a huge amount of time. But with a service like GeForce Now, what happens is that the games are always up to date, so you can spend less time waiting and more time gaming. And also on that note, pricing is definitely better than spending $2,000 on a massive gaming rig, as Priority gives members priority access to servers and 6-hour sessions on Priority rigs at only $9.99 a month. Ultimate, on the other hand, lets members play at up to 4K resolution with 120 frames per second with ultra-low latency on supported devices for unlimited 8-hour sessions. When you combine that with real-time ray tracing and Nvidia DLSS, we're talking the amount of support and graphical capabilities that would go into an RTX 40 series GPU, all for $20 a month. And that's without buying a gaming PC. What's really special about all of this is that if you wanted to just try something like this, Day Pass has let members try Priority or Ultimate memberships with all the benefits for a single day before you would sign up for a monthly plan. Priority Day Passes go for about $3.99 and Ultimate Day Passes for only $8. All of this means that right now in 2024, someone is capable of just pulling out their old laptop from 2010 whose battery really needs to remain plugged in or else it dies after 12 minutes, and you can play Total War Warhammer 3 on max settings with unit sizes like a $2,000 super rig. That's personally what I prefer to do with mine when I'm traveling. Now, all that being said, you do need a good internet connection and to be a good distance to one of Nvidia's data centers around the world. Still, for the majority of people in places like the United States, this is not going to be an issue. With the average internet speed being over 100 megabits per second, GeForce Now only requires about 45 megabits per second for 4K resolutions. In the end, when we look at all this, cloud gaming really does seem to be the future for many people, because let's face it, everything all over the place, whether it is in this country or the next, everything is getting more expensive all the time, even as our world seemingly becomes more connected. The idea of not having to pay for an expensive gaming rig and yet being able to play on nearly any screen in one's home or elsewhere is insane. And with something like GeForce Now, the possibilities are truly mind-boggling. The truth of the matter is, I may know a lot about the past. Really, only time will tell what the future is going to bring. My friends, thank you very much for watching. This has been Stucky with a history video here on the gaming page. I know that there's a lot of stuff that we went into today, and I want to thank Nvidia once again for actually sponsoring us for this video because I found the story behind it all to be fascinating. Make sure to click my links down in the description, and besides that, let me know what all type of videos you want to see. Honestly, if we want to go into some weird little gaming history and other types of things that would be fun for this channel, I wouldn't mind necessarily doing that, stuff where I can talk rather than sit at a screen and stare at it for 8 hours while I wait for Millennium Dawn to load. You all know the pain. You know what I'm talking about. Either way, my friends, thank you very much for watching. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you all next time. Goodbye, my friends.